Mark Hauser is a writer and a speaker. He's traveled across the country in search of the most awesome antique skyscrapers and digging up amazing stories behind each one. Please welcome Mark Hauser.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming here today. So a question that I get a lot is, what do I mean by antique skyscrapers? I mean, a skyscraper is something modern, right? But antique, that's something that's at your grandma's house that you're not allowed to touch because it's breakable. So those two things don't go together. That's a strange formulation. Well, let's do a little experiment. I'm going to ask you all, think of a skyscraper. Got one? What popped into your mind? I bet for a lot of you, it's this one. The Empire State Building, right? I mean, of course, this is a classic, naturally. This is the iconic, quintessential skyscraper. I mean, it's awe-inspiring, right? Towering over Manhattan. It was awe-inspiring for your grandma with her antiques, too, though, right? In fact, it was probably awe-inspiring for her grandma. The thing is, in less than a decade, the Empire State Building is going to celebrate its 100th birthday. So that's an antique, right? Pretty impressive, too, because almost a full century after the initial rollout, this is still the image of the technology that occurs to most people. I mean, if I ask you to think of a phone, or think of a car, or think of an airplane, you probably are not thinking of one that's 100 years old. But that's the skyscraper that we think of. And I mean, it was an amazing technological achievement for its time, but it wasn't anything really new, frankly, for New Yorkers, right? Because they'd had skyscrapers in their city for almost 50 years by then. Here's New York in 1910. First there on the left, that was the tallest skyscraper in the world building, it was called, Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper. In 1890, that was the world's tallest skyscraper. And then in 1899, that was the world's tallest skyscraper in Manhattan, the Park Row building. And in 1908, that was the world's tallest skyscraper, the Singer building. And then in 1913, that was the world's tallest skyscraper. I mean, can you believe that? Look at the size of that thing. Imagine what it was like to live during that time. And it wasn't just cities like New York or Chicago that are famous for their skyscrapers where this was happening. This was happening in every city in America. This was happening right here in Pittsburgh. This is an image of Pittsburgh in 1900. And back then we had two skyscrapers. We had the Carnegie Building, the darker one, and the Park Building, the lighter colored one. And then, of course, you can see the courthouse right up there dominating the skyline. Now, I'm going to highlight these buildings so that you can keep an eye on them when we fast forward our time machine just 10 years. Pow. Huh? Look at that. The thing is, those skyscrapers still exist here in Pittsburgh, but they have in turn been overshadowed by even taller, newer, shinier skyscrapers. So at some point, we stopped really noticing them until recently, and that's been changing. And now as people move back into their downtowns here in Pittsburgh and in New York and all across the country, they're starting to, appreciate these antique skyscrapers again. And they're moving into them, right? They're turning them into boutique hotels or condominiums or luxury apartment complexes. And so as this is going on and people are appreciating their skyscrapers again, these antique skyscrapers again, I think it's important to learn the stories behind them again, because the stories of these people are stories like our own. These are people who lived in a time of immense technological and social change. Their cities were changing faster than they could really keep track of. The technology was changing faster than they could imagine. And they faced the same kind of challenges that we face. They had dreams like we have. They had to struggle to succeed. And for these people, they overcame the odds, the people that built these skyscrapers, and they rose above. And so did their skyscrapers. They rose above too. So I think it's important for us to look at these buildings, think about the stories behind them, and be inspired by them. I mean, that was the intention of these builders in the first place. They wanted us to notice. They wanted us to be inspired by their legacy. This is a great example of one of these legacy skyscrapers. This is the Tribune Tower in Chicago, and it says its intention right on the floor of the lobby. It says, "When we build, let us imagine that we build forever." And the intention of the Tribune Tower was to be the home of the world's greatest newspaper. The publisher calls it the world's greatest newspaper, Robert McCormick. And so Robert McCormick wanted the world to know, so he had a contest in 1922 to build the world's greatest, most beautiful skyscraper to house his world's greatest newspaper. And architects sent in drawings from around the world, something like 260 of them. And the winning design, of course, on the left is based on a cathedral in France. It's Gothic. But a lot of people thought the judges made a mistake, and they should have picked the one on the right that actually won second prize. This was by a Finnish architect named Elil Saarinen. And although that building was never built, that drawing became more influential than the Tribune Tower ever was. And that's because it became the model for a new kind of architecture for skyscrapers called Art Deco. Now here's a great Art Deco skyscraper. This one's called the Eastern Columbia Building, and it's in Los Angeles. It's from 1930. And the image is from my newest project, which is called High Rises. Now, I'm teaming up with an artist from Philadelphia. His name is Chris Heitha, and what he does is he uses a drone to fly up and photograph under high resolution the tops of these amazing buildings, especially Art Deco buildings. And it gives you a view that you could never see from the street. We use new technology to appreciate old technology. And on the right there is Adolf Sirati, and this was his triumph. Right? Sirati was a Polish immigrant who came to Los Angeles and started up a little clock shop in town, and it was called Eastern. And Sirati was willing to take a risk that most people back then weren't in order to grow his business. Sirati decided he would sell his goods on credit. Most people weren't willing to trust customers back then, but he was. And so he was able to grow that business into a chain of housewares stores called Eastern Outfitters in California. And then he built another chain of stores. These were clothing stores called Columbia. And so this was the flagship department store in downtown Los Angeles. And I like to think about how proud Adolf Sirati, the immigrant, was standing there looking up at this grand Art Deco building with the clock way over the roofs of downtown Los Angeles. And think about his little clock shop and what he had built from something so modest. He held on to his dreams and stuck with them and persevered. Just like these guys, here's a building right here in Pittsburgh, a story about some people who had big dreams and were not afraid to pursue them. This is the Benedum Trees building. It's right down on 4th Avenue, pretty close to where we are now. And it was for a long time the headquarters of the Benedum Trees Oil Company. That's Michael Benedum and Joe Trees, the founders, and they also came from humble origins, like Adolf Sirati. I mean, Mike Benedum, his first job was in a flour mill. Joe Trees, his first job was a grammar school teacher. But then these oil wells started to be dug in western Pennsylvania in the late 1800s, and they saw that and thought, you know what, I'd really like to give that a shot and just see if I could make a fortune for myself. So they didn't really know anything about the oil business. Mike Benedum got his job solely with good manners. He was riding on a train, and an older gentleman came on, and Mike Benedum said, "Oh, you can have my seat, sir." And that gentleman turned out to be someone who worked for the oil company, so he hired Mike Benedum. Joe Trees had another strategy. He was really big. He was 6'3". He liked to play football, so he got Pitt to give him an athletic scholarship. And he went to the university and studied geology and engineering. And eventually the two guys got together and they started up a little oil company in West Virginia. And wouldn't you know it, the first time they drilled for oil, the very first well hit. And they were rich. And congratulations to Mike Benedum and Joe Trees for not only starting a successful oil company that then spread around to many other wildcatting oil drilling sites, but they also started charitable foundations. Mike Benedum's Benedum Foundation is actually still headquartered in the Benedum Trees building. Another foundation that's headquartered there, a modern one, is the Benter Foundation. And if you look up close on the top of the roof there, you'll see Bill Benter, the founder, and he's the guy in the suit. And standing there with him is an architect, Rob Pfaffman, and yours truly, along with my partner Chris Hytha in the High Rises venture. Chris is actually piloting a drone right there. He's holding the controls, so he's taking our picture. These men were very fortunate, as I told you. They succeeded with their very first well. But sometimes you don't drill for oil and find it the first time you look. Sometimes you have to fight through problems and obstacles. And sometimes, I know I sometimes feel this way, the obstacles can get so big that they seem insurmountable, and you start to think, no one would blame me if I just gave up. Have any of you ever felt that way? No one could blame me if I just gave up. Well, here's someone who also felt that way, I'm sure. Melly Esperson. Melly Esperson built the tallest skyscraper in all of Texas, but she got there only by struggle and fighting her way through problem after problem. She named the skyscraper after her husband, Niels Esperson. The two of them met in Oklahoma. Melly was with a family of homesteaders from Kansas, and Niels, well, he'd come to America from Denmark, hoping, first of all, to strike it rich in the gold rush. But it didn't pan out. I'm sorry. I think in the gold rush, they must have gotten really sick of that joke, right? I think that one wore thin quick. Jed, I will kill you with my bare hands if you say it didn't pan out. Anyway, it didn't pan out. So he became a real estate agent. They met in Oklahoma, and they fell in love. And the two got married. And quickly, Niels convinced his new bride, Melly, that they should move to Colorado because there was another gold rush on, and that would be their chance. So they picked up stakes and got everything and rolled out to Colorado and tried again and failed again. Did not find any gold. And not only that, but Niels got tuberculosis. So he got very ill. And he was sick for 2 years. Melly stayed by his side all of that time, nursed him back to health. They didn't have any kids, so they just had each other, and they were a team. And so while he was recuperating, they planned their next move. And this was it. They were going to borrow some money, the last money they could borrow, and give it one last try. But this time, instead of looking for gold, they would dig for oil back in Houston. And so they went, and they did. And lo and behold, after a couple dry wells, they finally struck oil, and their dreams had come true. And they were finally rich. And they said, let's build ourselves a big skyscraper in Houston to celebrate. And then Niels got sick again, and he died. And Melly was all alone. And so what did she do? She built the skyscraper herself. She had an office on the 25th floor with a deck outside where she was able to go and have tea every day with her associates. That was her afternoon tea spot. At the groundbreaking, Melly took the controls of the steam shovel and actually dug the first scoops of dirt. So she was indefatigable. Melly, you could not keep Melly down. In fact, later she went on to build another skyscraper next to the Niels Esperson building called the Melly Esperson building, of course. And it's a little bit shorter. It's right next door, but they stand shoulder to shoulder. But she didn't run the steam shovel when they built that building. And the reason is because Melly by that time had gotten sick too, and she was blind. So Melly never saw her skyscraper, and Niels never saw his skyscraper. Well, which is very ironic and also kind of romantic too, and inspiring, really, because she built a skyscraper that was honoring someone other than herself. And I think we can all take inspiration from that, right? We get to where we are not solely on our own merits. It's good to remember and honor the people who help us get to where we are. Here's another skyscraper that does that. This is the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And if you look closely, up on the top of it, there are sculptures of nurses. The Mayo Clinic was named for a British doctor, William Mayo, who came there to the edge of the prairie in Minnesota. And then one day, a tornado came there to the edge of the prairie and destroyed the city of Rochester. And so Dr. Mayo treated the victims, and a local order of nuns helped him. Many of them were nurses. And after he sort of saved so many of the people of the town, they were inspired to raise money to build him a hospital for him and for his two sons, who were also doctors. So he was very much indebted to these women. He was indebted to the nurses. And in addition, one of his sons married their first professional nurse. That's her there, Edith Graham. So, of course, they wanted to honor these women, and they did so by when they built the new Mayo Clinic in 1928, they put those statues on the top. Now, the Mayos, the nurses, the nuns, Melly Esperson, they all knew that if you run up against an obstacle, you fight through it, and you push, and you persevere, and you don't change, and don't veer off course. Except maybe sometimes you should veer off course, right? If we stay too focused on our own vision, we might miss out on an opportunity of another complete different possibility. And that really seems to be a factor of our modern world, we think, because of the pace of development. But I hope I'm convincing you that this pace of development is not a new development, and that people were dealing with this 100 years ago and more. Here's a great example. This is in Seattle, the city of Amazon and Microsoft and those high-tech companies. This is a high-tech company that happened more than a century ago. This is a high-tech company from the 1800s, and the result of it was this building, the Smith Tower. Lyman Smith was a guy who made shotguns. And that was a pretty good business back in the late 1800s. But then he heard about something his competitor was doing. And this was a company called Remington that also made guns. But it found out that its engineers, who were really good at making the little metal pieces for guns, were also good at making the little metal pieces for this new piece of technology called typewriters. And typewriters back then had a high upside potential, we might say, right? As businesses began to grow, it became an advantage for a corporation to be able to have its secretaries and its clerks, instead of writing everything out longhand, be able to type, right? So Lyman Smith shifted his company to typewriters. He shifted his company to type. He literally shifted the company. He made this is a justifiable joke. It was the first company that had both upper and lowercase letters on its typewriters. Smith. It became Smith Corona. And so that's the Smith building in Seattle. Lyman Smith built this office building in Seattle that was the tallest building on the West Coast for pretty much half the 20th century, until it was eventually passed up by the more famous Space Needle in Seattle. And in fact, when tourists go to Seattle now, that's usually where they go, right, to the Space Needle. But I think you should go to the Smith Tower. If you ever go out to Seattle, go there instead. And here's why. At the top floor, it has this great cocktail lounge with Chinese decorations. That's the original decor. And you can have a nice little drink, and then you can walk out onto a 360-degree promenade around the outside, where you can have these gorgeous views of Puget Sound and the city, and if you're lucky and the weather cooperates, you can take a picture of Mount Rainier. So before I go, I'd like to tell you one more story about skyscrapers and a man behind an antique skyscraper. This sort of knits together all the themes I've been talking about. Okay, this is somebody who came from humble origins. He struggled through failures. He was willing to sort of shift his business strategy when he saw an opportunity arise, and then he persevered and eventually found great success. And that's the story of Frank Woolworth, who you see here. His is the building that we saw at the beginning of the program that just blasted through the stratosphere and dominated Manhattan's skyline from 1913 until the skyscrapers we think of as skyscrapers, the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building came along. He was a potato farmer originally, and that was not an exciting career prospect for him. So as a young man, he just was desperate to get off the potato farm. And he, at one point, he went to the local dry goods store in town, and he said, "I will work for you for free for 3 months if you just please hire me." So they did. That was an offer they couldn't turn down. Nevertheless, he turned out to be really bad at sales clerking. So what he did instead, the boss said, take care of the stockroom, Frank, and maybe, do the window displays. And one day he got a job of spreading out a table, and on it there was to be merchandise that was priced at only 5 cents. So everything on the table, 5 cents a piece. That was, soap, pens, harmonicas, knitting needles. And the thing is, this was kind of a novelty back then in the late 1800s to have a table of everything cost the same, so you just drop a nickel and take it. This was a big hit. Frank actually talked the boss into loaning him some of the inventory so we could go down the road a piece and open his own 5 and 10 cent store and give that a try. And that was a great success too. And before he knew it, Frank Woolworth was overseeing an empire of almost 300 5 and dime stores across America. And it was such a success that every year he would go to Europe and look for new merchandise that he could sell in his 5 and dimes. And one day he went up on top of this brand new building in Paris called the Eiffel Tower, and he said, "Whoa, I got to have something like this." So he came back to New York and he hired one of the great early skyscraper architects, Cass Gilbert, to build him the Woolworth building. The amazing thing to think about is it was built with pennies, because that was the profit at Woolworth. The profit on every sale was about a penny. You sell something for a nickel, you keep a penny. So think about all those pennies coming together to build the Woolworth building. He was able to pay it off in a year. Actually, he built it for cash. And then within a year, it paid itself off. One of the reasons it did was the leases. Because as Cass Gilbert, that architect, said, a skyscraper is a machine that makes the land pay. And so that's what he did with it. He had 2 floors of the 50-plus floors of the Woolworth building for his offices and the company offices, and the rest were leases. And so very soon that building was making him a ton of money, in addition to all those pennies. And if you go inside, this building has one of the most remarkable, beautiful lobbies that you'll see. It looks like a church, or, well, they called it the Cathedral of Commerce, and you can see why. And if you look up in one little alcove there, there's that marvelous statue of Frank Woolworth himself. And what's he doing? He's counting up his nickels and dimes. It's been wonderful to talk to you today. I hope that these stories bring you some inspiration about people that struggled with the same kind of changes that we have to deal with today. It's nice to know that our problems are not unique to our lives. And if I have a challenge for you today, it's this. When you're walking down the street, take a look around you and think about those buildings, not just the new ones, but the old ones too, and the struggles that each one of them represents, and the legacy that each one represents. And think about what kind of legacy you would like to leave behind. What would you like people to wonder about when they see your works? Keep looking up. Thank you very much.